the arrival and the tension. Ebony James took a deep breath, steadying herself as she approached the sleek aircraft. She had long since come to terms with the fact that success came with its own set of challenges, challenges she had always faced head-on. But as she made her way toward the jet, something in the air felt off. It was more than just the coolness of the morning breeze or the hum of the engines in the background. There was a palpable unease in the air, something almost tangible. She told herself it was just nerves. After all, today was supposed to be a celebration. This private jet was the culmination of years of work, late nights, and sacrifices. She had built her empire from the ground up, brick by brick. Every obstacle, every rejection had only strengthened her resolve. She had worked twice as hard as everyone else, and now, this was her reward. But as she approached the aircraft, the feeling of tension grew stronger. Ebony could feel the eyes of the few scattered airport staff on her as she passed by, watching with curiosity, some whispering behind their hands. She knew she didn't belong here in their eyes, at least not in the way they imagined a woman of her skin color should. But she had learned long ago to ignore the whispers, the sideways glances, and the judgment. She had learned to silence the doubts that others tried to project onto her. And yet, this moment felt different. Something was off. She noticed the two pilots standing by the aircraft. One was older, with graying hair at the temples, his uniform impeccably pressed. The other was younger, with dark aviator sunglasses and a stern face. Both were waiting at the foot of the plane's stairs, watching her approach. Their postures were stiff, almost guarded. Ebony's first instinct was to walk past them confidently. She had earned every step that had led her here. This was her plane. But as she came closer, she sensed something, a silent communication between the two pilots. The older man shifted his weight, and the younger one met her gaze with an expression she couldn't quite place. A quick flash of unease washed over her, but she pushed it down. She had come too far, worked too hard to let anything, or anyone, ruin this moment. When she reached the bottom of the aircraft stairs, she smiled politely, ready to greet the pilots as she always did with any other professional interaction. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady and composed. But even as she spoke, she could feel the weight of their silent stares. The older pilot nodded in greeting, his expression neutral. But it was the younger one who spoke first, his tone cold, almost dismissive. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you'll have to leave," he said, crossing his arms. Ebony's mind blanked for a moment. Was he joking? She stood there, blinking, trying to process the words. This was her aircraft. Her name was written on it in elegant cursive letters. She had signed every check, made every decision, and faced every obstacle to get here. No one, not even a pilot, had the right to tell her she couldn't board. She glanced at Jeremy, her trusted assistant, who stood a few feet behind her. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his posture tense. He, too, had heard the exchange and, like Ebony, couldn't fathom what was happening. "I beg your pardon." Ebony managed, her voice more confused than angry at first. She was waiting for him to laugh, to say he was joking. But there was no sign of humor in his eyes. "You'll need to return to the terminal, ma'am," the younger pilot repeated, his tone more insistent now. "Excuse me," Ebony said, her composure slipping slightly as she stepped closer. "This is my jet. I own it. I have every right to board." The younger pilot's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid the decision has already been made." His gaze didn't soften as he held up a hand to signal the security personnel nearby. "You won't be flying today." Ebony's pulse quickened as the weight of his words sank in. She had heard of discrimination, of subtle bias in the business world, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't just bias, it was blatant obstruction. "Are you telling me I can't board my own plane?" Ebony's voice had hardened, and she could feel the edge in her words. The older pilot finally spoke, his voice quieter and almost apologetic. There's nothing we can do, ma'am. It's not up to us. We've been given instructions not to let you board. Ebony's throat tightened. What was happening? Who was giving these instructions? And why? She glanced back at Jeremy, her mind racing. His expression was filled with concern, but there was nothing he could do either. Ebony had never felt so powerless in her entire life. The anger bubbling inside her was undeniable. She had worked too hard, fought too much, and bled too much for this moment to be stolen from her by an arbitrary decision. No, she said firmly, her voice rising with authority. I'm not leaving. This is my plane, and I'm getting on it. The younger pilot stood his ground, not giving an inch. The security guards, sensing the escalating situation, moved closer. You need to leave the premises, ma'am, one of them said. His voice wasn't hostile, but it was clear they had been given their orders. Ebony could feel the blood rushing in her ears. This was absurd. Was this a form of harassment? An abuse of power? Or something more insidious? Her hand tightened on her bag as her mind quickly went over the options. She could call her lawyer, make a scene, or push back with everything she had. But the realization slowly began to sink in, this wasn't just about her. This was a fight for dignity. This was a fight for her right to exist in a space where she had earned her place. I'm not going anywhere, Ebony said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. You'll regret this. I'll have you both fired for this. The younger pilot raised his eyebrows, clearly unfazed by her threat. You can do whatever you want, ma'am. But you won't be boarding this plane. The officers stepped forward, but Ebony wasn't about to give in. She wasn't backing down. Get your supervisor, she demanded. Now. The officers exchanged a look but nodded, walking off to make the call. Ebony stood tall, her posture proud, even as the weight of the situation bore down on her. She was not just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every woman and person of color who had been made to feel small in a world that didn't understand their worth. Minutes later, the sound of a car engine approaching broke the stillness. Ebony turned, her heart pounding. It was the unmistakable hum of a black sedan, the kind she knew well. Lydia Carter stepped out of the vehicle. Lydia was more than just a business advisor to Ebony, she was a force in her own right. The moment Lydia arrived, the atmosphere shifted. She walked toward Ebony with purpose, her heels clicking firmly on the tarmac. What's going on here? Lydia asked, her voice calm but laced with authority. They're refusing to let me board my own plane, Ebony replied, still trying to process everything. Lydia's eyes flicked toward the pilots and then back to Ebony. Stay calm. We'll handle this. With that, Lydia stepped toward the younger pilot, her presence commanding attention. Ebony could see the younger man falter slightly, recognizing Lydia's reputation. What's your name? Lydia asked, her voice crisp. The pilot hesitated, but after a moment, he responded. John Matthews. John Matthews, Lydia repeated slowly, almost savoring the name. You've made a mistake today, and I'll make sure you don't forget it. Ebony stood in silence as Lydia continued to speak with the pilot, her anger slowly shifting to a quiet, determined resolve. She didn't know what Lydia was saying, but she knew one thing for certain, this wouldn't be the last time the world heard Ebony James's name. Confrontation and betrayal. Lydia's presence was like a storm front moving through the calm of the airstrip. Ebony watched as her business advisor stood with unshaken confidence, addressing the younger pilot, John Matthews, in a voice that carried both authority and the weight of experience. Lydia was a seasoned professional who had navigated her own battles, and the way she handled herself made Ebony feel like she was no longer alone in this. Listen, Lydia began, her tone cool and deliberate. You've just made a very serious mistake, and I intend to make sure it's corrected. You can't just refuse a passenger, especially one who is not only a client but the owner of this aircraft. If you think you can intimidate her, you're very much mistaken. The younger pilot's expression tightened, and for the first time, Ebony saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He stepped back slightly, but his defiance didn't completely waver. It was clear that he had been given orders, and whatever they were, he was following them with an almost obsessive commitment. "But ma'am," John Matthews began, his voice laced with a mix of defensiveness and irritation. "It's not about who owns the plane. There are instructions I have to follow. The decision's already been made." Lydia didn't let him finish. "Instructions from whom?" she asked sharply. Her gaze was unwavering, her posture unyielding. "Who made this decision? Because I can assure you, this isn't going to stay between us. Not for long." Ebony could feel her frustration rising once more. The indignity of it all, the outright disrespect. She had fought her entire life for a seat at the table, and now, these men were going to deny her something she had earned? Her fists clenched at her sides, her breath coming faster. But she knew that letting her anger get the best of her wouldn't help. Not now. She turned to Jeremy, who had been standing silently behind her, his face a mask of concern. "Jeremy, make the call," Ebony instructed, her voice steady but sharp. Jeremy nodded quickly, stepping aside to dial the number she had requested. Lydia didn't wait for the younger pilot to respond. She turned toward the security officers who had been lingering by the plane's side, their eyes trained on the scene but offering no intervention. "You're making a grave mistake here, too," Lydia said, her voice firm. "And you should know that we'll be filing a formal complaint. There's no room for this kind of treatment in today's world. Not from people who think they can hold others back simply because of the color of their skin or because they think they have more power than they actually do." Ebony felt a surge of relief. Lydia's words had an almost immediate effect. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for the confrontation. One of them shifted on his feet, clearly trying to make himself scarce, as if hoping the entire situation would somehow resolve itself. But Ebony wasn't going to let it slide. She was tired of being the one who had to play by the rules, who had to prove herself every step of the way. Every time she had taken a leap forward, there had always been someone or something that tried to pull her back, to make her question if she belonged. But this? This was different. This wasn't just a fight for herself. It was a fight for every person who had ever felt less than, for every woman of color who had been pushed aside in favor of someone else. She glanced back at the younger pilot, who stood there, still defiant but visibly sweating under Lydia's unwavering gaze. "You think you can just stop me?" she asked, her voice low and filled with authority. "You think you can tell me where I belong and where I don't? You don't know who I am, but you will soon enough." Before the younger pilot could respond, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "We've had enough of this nonsense." Ebony turned to see the airport manager approaching, his face pinched with concern. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and a reputation for taking his job very seriously. He was someone Ebony had met several times during the process of acquiring the jet, but she never imagined he'd be the one to make things right today. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Ebony didn't waste any time. "Yes," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm being denied access to my own aircraft by this pilot and his colleague. And I want to know why." The airport manager's eyes darted to the two pilots, then back to Ebony. He looked at Lydia as well, his face faltering under the weight of the situation. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice low. "I need to investigate this further." "Investigation?" Lydia repeated, incredulous. "There's no need for an investigation. The investigation should already have been done. You're looking at the owner of this plane. This is her property, and yet she's being treated like an intruder. What kind of system are you running here?" The airport manager's face reddened as the pressure mounted. He didn't respond immediately, instead turning to the pilots. The older pilot looked uncomfortably at the younger one, who had grown increasingly agitated. The situation was spiraling out of control, and the older pilot clearly knew it. "I'll take responsibility for this," the older pilot said, his voice shaky but filled with authority. "There's been a misunderstanding. We'll fix it." But the younger pilot, still unyielding, shook his head. "No, we won't. The orders are clear. No one boards until we've received further instructions." Ebony couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Further instructions," she repeated, stepping forward, her resolve hardening. "From who? Who gives orders like this?" The younger pilot refused to answer, but the older pilot finally broke the silence, stepping forward reluctantly. "It came from the top. From the captain." Lydia's gaze turned icy. "The captain?" she asked, her voice now tinged with suspicion. "And where exactly is this captain?" The older pilot hesitated for a moment, then lowered his eyes. "He's in his office." "But—" "Then go get him," Lydia interjected, her tone cutting through the air. "And bring him here. Now." For a moment, the younger pilot looked like he might refuse, but the older man, sensing that things were spiraling quickly, nodded and turned toward the terminal. Ebony didn't look away from the pilots, her heart racing in her chest. She had been ready for this moment. Ready for the fight, ready to take control. But this was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just about her. This was about something much larger. She wasn't just fighting for her flight. She was fighting for respect. As she stood there, waiting for the captain to arrive, she couldn't help but wonder, what else would it take for the world to see her? What else would it take for people to stop questioning her right to exist in spaces where they had once refused to let her in? And as the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second, one thing was certain, Ebony James was not going to back down. Not now. Not ever. When the captain arrived minutes later, Ebony was ready. She had been pushed too far. She was ready to make her stand. The fallout. The captain arrived a few minutes later, his presence commanding the room with an unspoken authority. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his silver hair neatly combed, and his aviator sunglasses still perched on his nose, despite the indoor setting. He looked every bit the part of a man who had flown countless miles and seen everything that the sky had to offer. Yet, something about his presence felt off. His eyes carried an unspoken tension, an air of reluctance as though he was already dreading the conversation ahead. Ebony stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the captain as he approached, his footsteps slow but deliberate. Lydia, as always, remained by her side, exuding confidence and control. But Ebony could feel her pulse quicken. This was the moment when everything would either be resolved or the situation would escalate beyond their control. The captain's eyes flicked to the younger pilot standing off to the side. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone clipped but measured. He clearly wasn't used to being questioned, and the fact that this confrontation had dragged on for so long was already making him uneasy. "Captain," Lydia said, stepping forward, her voice steady. "This is Ebony James, the owner of this aircraft. She was denied boarding by your pilots without cause or explanation. And now we're trying to understand why." The captain's eyes widened briefly at the mention of Ebony's name, but his gaze quickly hardened. "This is a misunderstanding," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I was simply following protocol." Ebony's heart sank at the words, the sting of the captain's response hitting her like a physical blow. "Protocol?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "What protocol? My name is on that plane, on every document, on every registration. I own it. And you're telling me that your protocol says I can't board it?" The captain didn't answer immediately. His gaze dropped to the ground for a moment as if he were trying to figure out how to escape the rising tension. But there was no escaping this moment. Ebony wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. "Captain," Lydia said again, her voice lowering but carrying a chilling undertone. "There's no protocol that can override the simple fact that this woman owns the plane. You're not here to dictate who boards and who doesn't. If you are, then you've just crossed a line." The captain's face reddened as he shifted uncomfortably under Lydia's scrutiny. He opened his mouth to respond, but it was clear he wasn't sure how to defend his actions. The younger pilot, still standing in the background, shot an anxious glance at the captain, as if silently urging him to explain himself or somehow make the situation disappear. Ebony could feel the anger bubbling inside her again. She wasn't angry just at the captain, she was angry at the entire system that allowed people like him to get away with treating others like they were less than. She had built this empire on her own, without anyone's help, and now this man was treating her like she didn't belong, like she was an imposter in a world where she had every right to be. The injustice of it all made her blood boil. "I want answers," Ebony said firmly, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "And I don't care about your so-called protocol. I'm asking you, as a businesswoman and as the owner of this aircraft, why did you deny me boarding?" The captain opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered on his lips. The longer he hesitated, the more nervous he seemed. Finally, he sighed and dropped his shoulders, a look of resignation spreading across his face. "I didn't make the decision," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I was told to keep you off the flight. There was nothing I could do about it." Ebony's heart skipped a beat. "Told by who?" she demanded, her voice growing louder. "Who gave you the authority to keep me off my own plane?" The captain didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the younger pilot, who stood silently, avoiding eye contact. It was clear that the captain was waiting for him to take responsibility, but the younger pilot refused to speak. Finally, after a long pause, the captain spoke again. "The orders came from the top," he said quietly. "The company's CEO issued a directive. They were concerned about the optics of you flying alone in a private jet, and they didn't want to risk it. So, they instructed me to stop you from boarding." Ebony felt the world tilt on its axis. The word struck her like a thunderclap. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice trembling with fury. "The CEO? The company's CEO issued a directive? You mean to tell me that someone in that company decided to stop me from boarding because of how it would look? Because of me?" The captain nodded, but he looked genuinely remorseful now. It was clear that he was just a pawn in this situation, but that didn't make his actions any less hurtful. "Yes," he admitted. "It was a misunderstanding, a mistake. But the decision was made." Lydia let out a sharp laugh, her disbelief echoing through the tense silence. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice rising. "This isn't a mistake. This is an attempt to undermine a woman's hard work and success because of who she is. This is the kind of systemic discrimination that continues to hold people like Ebony back. And it needs to stop now." Ebony turned away from Lydia for a moment, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. She had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but this was something she had never expected. It wasn't just about the pilots anymore, it was about a system that refused to acknowledge her worth, that tried to erase everything she had worked so hard to build. For a moment, she thought of all the obstacles she had faced in her career, the countless times she had been told no, the countless doors that had been slammed in her face. But each time, she had pushed through. She had always found a way to succeed, even when the world seemed to be working against her. And now, more than ever, she realized that her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough. It was for every person who had been made to feel small because of who they were or where they came from. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Ebony said, her voice growing cold. "I don't care what orders you were given. You will never stop me. You will never take away what I've worked for. And I'll make sure the entire world knows about this." Lydia stood by her side, nodding in agreement. "We'll make sure this goes public," she said. The world needs to see how these systems operate. And they need to understand that no one, has the right to strip away a woman's success simply because of her race or gender. As the captain shifted uncomfortably, his face darkening with shame, Ebony turned away, her eyes narrowing with determination. She didn't care what they tried to throw at her. She had been knocked down before, but she always got back up. And this time would be no different. The battle wasn't over yet. And this was only the beginning. A victory unseen. Ebony sat in the terminal lounge, her hands resting on her lap as she stared out at the tarmac, watching the plane that should have been hers. The conflict from earlier in the day had left an indelible mark on her. She could still feel the weight of the captain's words, the unspoken prejudice in the air, and the crushing frustration of being denied something she had every right to claim. But as the minutes turned into hours, Ebony's anger began to settle into a sense of purpose. She had always known the world wouldn't make things easy for her. From the very start of her career, she had been forced to prove herself time and time again. And now, this latest act of injustice, this blatant attempt to discredit her hard work and achievements, was only fueling the fire within her. It wasn't just about the plane anymore. It wasn't even about the pilots. This was about the larger, systemic issues that still pervaded industries, both corporate and aviation, that thought they could decide who deserved success and who didn't. Ebony had fought for everything she had. Nothing had been handed to her. She had faced rejection and ridicule, had been told no more times than she cared to remember, but she always found a way to overcome it. And this time, too, she wouldn't let this moment define her. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a text from Lydia. "I've made the calls. We're not letting this go. I've got the lawyers involved. The CEO's going to have to answer for this." Ebony's heart fluttered with relief. Lydia was a force to be reckoned with, and Ebony knew she would fight tooth and nail to make sure the injustice didn't go unchallenged. The whole situation, the way she had been treated, would be brought to light. It wasn't just about compensation, it was about sending a message that this kind of treatment wouldn't be tolerated. "I need to speak to the CEO," Ebony muttered to herself. She couldn't wait for the corporate machinery to move at its own pace. She needed direct action. And fast. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her victory couldn't come only through legal action or a public apology. No, her real victory would come when the system itself changed, when the barriers were broken down for everyone who followed after her. At that moment, the door to the lounge opened, and Jeremy stepped inside, looking slightly frazzled but with a hopeful expression. He had been in and out of the room, taking care of logistics and handling some of the calls from the team. But when he saw Ebony's face, he knew she was still in the thick of it. "Ebony, I've got news," he said, pulling out his phone. "I just got off the line with the airport manager. The CEO's office called. They're offering a full apology." Ebony's eyes narrowed. "An apology?" "Yes," Jeremy said, pausing. "But that's not all. They're offering to reimburse you for today's flight, and they're willing to make public statements to explain the misunderstanding." She let out a sharp breath, then shook her head. "Reimbursement," she repeated. "What are they doing, trying to make this go away with money?" Jeremy hesitated for a moment. "They're trying to make it right, Ebony. They want to avoid the public backlash. They're worried about the PR disaster that's brewing." Ebony stood up slowly, her hands still clenched by her sides. "I don't need their apology. And I don't need their money." Her eyes locked on Jeremy's, her gaze unwavering. "What I need is for them to understand that this is not just about a flight. This is about respect. This is about acknowledging that I belong here, we belong here. That nothing is handed to us. We've worked for everything we've earned." Jeremy opened his mouth to speak but closed it when he saw the fierce determination in her eyes. He could see it now, Ebony wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been told they didn't deserve to be in a certain space. Anyone who had been told no just because of who they were. "We're going to take this all the way," Ebony said. "And I'm going to make sure they never forget what happened here." Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Lydia. "Ebony," Lydia's voice came through strong, "I've spoken with the lawyers, and we're moving forward with this. We're going public with it. They've asked for a meeting with you tomorrow." Ebony's eyes flashed with determination. "I'm not interested in a meeting with them. I'm interested in making sure this situation doesn't happen again to anyone else." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Lydia spoke again, her voice calm but resolute. "I'll make sure the media gets the story. You've earned your seat at the table, and now it's time for the world to know it. This is about more than one flight. It's about breaking down the walls that have kept women like us from flying high." Ebony could hear the underlying power in Lydia's words. It was more than just a fight for personal justice, it was a fight for change. "I'm with you, Lydia," Ebony replied. "Let's do this." The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and carefully worded statements. Ebony was relentless, coordinating with her team to ensure that every angle was covered. The media began to pick up the story, and soon, it was all over the news: the wealthy businesswoman who had been denied access to her own private jet, the pilots who had been caught in the middle, and the CEO who had issued the orders. The public response was swift and powerful. People across the country, and even globally, rallied behind Ebony. Social media exploded with hashtags in her support, and many individuals who had faced similar discrimination shared their stories, creating a wave of solidarity. What had started as a personal battle had turned into a movement, a call for systemic change. The airport's management, initially reluctant to respond publicly, quickly backpedaled, issuing a full, public apology to Ebony and her company. They promised to implement new training protocols for their staff to prevent future incidents of discrimination, and they made a pledge to actively support diversity and inclusion within their organization. Ebony's team worked tirelessly to ensure that the situation was rectified. In the coming weeks, the pilots were placed on administrative leave, and after a full investigation, they were dismissed from their positions. The airline, now in damage control mode, took swift action to prevent any further fallout. But for Ebony, this was more than just a victory in the corporate world. It was a victory for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was a victory for the women who had been underestimated, for the people of color who had been ignored, for anyone who had been made to feel small or invisible. Ebony took a deep breath as she stood by the tarmac once more, looking out at her jet, the one she had fought for, the one she had earned. It was no longer just a symbol of her success, it had become a symbol of something much larger. This was just the beginning. As the jet's engines roared to life, Ebony smiled to herself. She was soaring higher now, not just in the sky, but in a world that would never see her as anything less than extraordinary. No one would ever tell her she didn't belong here again, the legacy of change. The weeks that followed the incident saw Ebony's life transform in ways she hadn't anticipated. What had started as a personal battle against injustice had turned into something much larger, a defining moment that reverberated through the corporate world and beyond. The story of her fight against discrimination on her own plane quickly became more than just a headline, it became a movement, a call to action for those who had been overlooked, underestimated, and oppressed. Ebony had received an outpouring of support from all corners of the world. Business leaders, activists, and even strangers who had faced similar struggles reached out to her, sharing their stories and offering their solidarity. The hashtag #EbonyFlight became a rallying cry for those demanding better treatment in industries across the globe. It was clear that Ebony's fight had struck a nerve, and she knew she couldn't let this moment slip into the past without pushing for meaningful change. But as the initial media frenzy began to settle, Ebony was faced with a new challenge: how to channel the momentum from the media storm into something sustainable. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't enough. Ebony knew that real change required more than a single incident or a series of headlines, it required systemic shifts, cultural revolutions within industries that had long been set in their outdated ways. Determined to lead that charge, Ebony began to expand her influence. She became more involved in advocacy for diversity and inclusion in the corporate world, using her platform to speak about the challenges faced by women of color and marginalized groups in spaces that traditionally belonged to white men. She started holding talks and workshops, partnering with organizations that focused on empowering women, creating pathways for success, and dismantling discriminatory practices. Her voice resonated with people who felt unheard and unrepresented, and she became a beacon of possibility for those who had always been told that their dreams were unattainable. Ebony's business empire, too, saw dramatic growth as a result of her newfound visibility. What had once been a modest company had blossomed into a global brand, attracting attention from investors, influencers, and industry leaders alike. Her story became an emblem of perseverance, and her company became synonymous with breaking barriers, not just in the corporate world, but in every sphere where the systemic inequality of the past still held sway. But with this success came an overwhelming responsibility. Ebony had known from the beginning that when you climb the ladder, you are expected to reach back and pull others up with you. She took this duty seriously, ensuring that her company's hiring practices were inclusive and that they supported programs designed to uplift minority communities and provide opportunities for those who had traditionally been excluded. As the months went by, Ebony began to take her message on the road. She traveled to conferences, universities, and leadership summits, speaking not just about her own journey but about the collective journey of every woman, every person of color, and every underrepresented group who had ever had their dreams crushed under the weight of prejudice. Her words inspired a generation of leaders who were determined to create change, and her personal story became a foundation for a broader discussion about justice, equality, and the future of leadership. The incident at the airport, the one that had sparked her rise to prominence, had shifted from a painful moment of exclusion into a touchstone for a much larger social movement. Ebony's company, now valued at billions, made its mark on the global stage as a symbol of what could be achieved when people dared to dream beyond the boundaries others had set for them. But for Ebony, the work was far from over. She had achieved so much, but the victories she'd fought for weren't personal ones, they were shared victories, and she was determined to ensure they didn't stop with her. She wanted to make sure that no woman, no person of color, and no one from an underrepresented group would ever face the same kind of discrimination that she had. She had earned her seat at the table, and she was going to make sure others did, too. The conversations she led around diversity and inclusion gained traction within some of the most powerful companies in the world. Corporate giants began to adopt her model of inclusive leadership, understanding that a diverse workforce wasn't just morally right, it was economically beneficial. The shift began slowly, but it was undeniable. Women of color began to occupy higher positions in boardrooms, their voices more often heard in discussions that had once been dominated by white men. As her influence grew, Ebony received an invitation that would mark yet another major turning point in her career. A global summit on women's empowerment, held in the heart of Paris, was offering her a chance to deliver the keynote speech, an opportunity to solidify her role as a leader in the fight for diversity, equality, and justice. Ebony knew the weight of this invitation, but she also knew the power of her own voice. It was time to take the message to the world, to speak from the heart about the ongoing battle for equal representation. The day of the summit arrived, and Ebony stood before an audience of thousands, corporate leaders, entrepreneurs, activists, and politicians, all waiting to hear what she had to say. She could feel the weight of the moment, the collective energy of the crowd, and the unspoken expectations pressing in on her. But Ebony felt an inner peace that she hadn't felt in years. She had come full circle, from a woman who had been denied access to her own plane, to a woman who now stood at the precipice of history. She took a deep breath, stepped up to the podium, and began to speak. I stand here today, not just as a businesswoman, but as a woman who knows what it's like to be told no when you've worked your entire life to hear a yes. I stand here because I know what it's like to face barriers that no one should have to face. And I stand here because I believe that every single person deserves a seat at the table. But that seat has to be earned, and it has to be protected. Ebony's voice echoed through the hall as she recounted her journey, the challenges she had faced, and the lessons she had learned. She spoke of the importance of mentorship, of building networks that supported underrepresented groups, and of the need for true equality in every industry. By the end of her speech, the entire room was on its feet, applauding not just her achievements, but the vision she had shared. Ebony had done more than overcome adversity, she had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for millions around the world who were fighting their own battles against systemic inequality. That night, as Ebony returned to her hotel room, she looked out at the city below. The lights of Paris twinkled in the distance, and for a moment, she allowed herself to reflect on everything she had achieved. She had come so far. From that moment on the tarmac when she had been denied boarding her own plane to this moment, standing on a global stage, her story was no longer just her own. It was a story that would inspire future generations to rise, to demand what was rightfully theirs, and to never settle for less. Ebony smiled to herself, knowing this was only the beginning. The world was changing, and she was at the forefront of it. Her voice would continue to echo, inspiring change in every corner of the globe. And in the distance, as the jet engines roared to life once more, Ebony knew that she was finally flying. And this time, no one would ever tell her to stop.